On May 4, 2015, officers from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office in Florida were following through on a tip. The Regional Gang Task Force was about to make an unusual arrest, and in so doing they would help the U.S. Marshals close their longest-running manhunt ever to catch a fugitive. On a stretch of marshland near the western edge of Melbourne, Florida, hidden by thickets of palm trees, sat the isolated, run-down, algae-streaked trailer that was home to a 79-year-old trucker, amateur guitarist, and suspected outlaw known as William Cox. When Cox answered the door, one of the officers held up an old black-and-white photo of an Ohio man named Frank Freshwaters. He asked if Cox recognized the man in the 1957 mugshot. Cox responded that he hadn't seen that man for a long time. Pressing, the cop followed up, "Are you that man?" And indeed, he was. Once, Cox went off with the police without protest. His life had come full circle, and his 55 years and 7 months on the lam were at an end. Frank Harold Freshwaters was the real name of a man who'd been living under the alias of William Cox since 1959. When he fled from a prison camp in northern Ohio, Freshwaters had served part of his sentence at the Ohio State Reformatory in the city of Mansfield. That imposing castle-like complex is where the well-loved 1994 film The Shawshank Redemption was shot. And so, perhaps inevitably, news reports following Freshwaters' 2015 arrest dubbed him the Shawshank Fugitive. Does that mean this is the real-life story behind the movie? Well, the short answer is no. The connection was always fairly tenuous. The Shawshank Redemption, which starred Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, is based on a Stephen King novella that is a work of fiction. Both the movie and the story take place in Maine, not Ohio, the location of filming notwithstanding. The action takes place between the 1940s and the 1960s, and so it does overlap with the period when Freshwaters was an inmate at the penitentiary in Ohio. But whereas the Andy Dufresne, the protagonist in Frank Darabont's movie, and King's story, spends the better part of 2 decades behind bars at the equally fictional Shawshank State Penitentiary, Freshwaters was only locked up in the Mansfield, Ohio prison for a matter of months. He soon received a transfer to a minimum security facility. Dufresne eventually makes his getaway by chiseling a small hole in the stony prison walls. Freshwaters wasn't even being held at the Ohio State Reformatory when he made his escape. And while the character Dufresne, a banker, was innocent of the double homicide for which he was wrongfully convicted, Freshwaters was guilty and remorseful for the crime that defined his early life. So it's a very different story, but in its own way, it's quite a cinematic tale as well. At a little after 11 p.m. on July 3, 1957, Eugene Flint, aged 24, an Army veteran and father of 3, was getting home from his late shift working at the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. From across the street, his wife Garnet saw Eugene get out of the truck and went to put coffee on for him. Young Frank Freshwaters worked for another rubber company. Rubber and tires were what put Akron on the map, and it was a boom time for the car industry. And that night, Frank was burning some rubber himself, tearing down the street in his 1953 Mercury at 50 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Hearing a crash, Garnet Flint turned to see her husband get hit and go flying. Eugene Flint died from his injuries in a hospital less than an hour later. Police cited Freshwaters for a non-working car horn and broken emergency brake, either one of which might have prevented or mitigated the accident. But the real-life charge he'd face would be manslaughter. At trial, Freshwaters already expressed horror at his own actions, crying as he pleaded to the judge, "It's not something like a nightmare which is gone in a day, it stays with you." The comment was prescient. Freshwaters gave a lowball estimate of his speed behind the wheel, which didn't stick, but the sentence ended up being quite lenient for Freshwaters, who was 22 at the time of the trial the following April. His 16-year-old wife Patricia had given birth to their first son 6 months earlier. For his crime, Freshwaters was given a prison term of 1 to 20 years, but the sentence was suspended. That meant he never had to see the inside of a cell, so long as he abided by his 5-year probation. The terms included not driving a car and paying $5 per week in restitution to Garnet Flint. The sum would only be around $44 in 2019 money, but was to offer at least some assistance to the widow and her children. Nonetheless, the apparently cash-strapped Freshwaters failed to keep up the payments. On top of that, he was caught driving with a fake license. So the prison sentence became active and Freshwaters was sent to the facility in Mansfield. But once at the penitentiary, Freshwaters quickly developed a reputation as a cooperative inmate. Thus, he was transferred from the Osborne Honor Farm, adjacent to the city of Sandusky, Ohio, and just inland from Lake Erie. The farm grew vegetables and hogs used for food elsewhere in Ohio's prison system, and would have been a relief compared to the stultifying conditions at the Ohio State Reformatory. Freshwaters was assigned to work in the mess hall of the nearby Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Home, a nursing facility for veterans a short distance from the farm itself. On September 31, 1959, Freshwaters and another inmate made their escape. They were last spotted on the road outside the home heading south just before 5 p.m. Both were in prison garb, blue jeans with red stripes and gray and white striped shirts. The exact circumstances for the escape aren't recorded. However they did it that afternoon would be the last time anyone saw or heard from Frank Freshwaters for a long time. Not long after the escape, the state of Florida issued a driver's license to one William Cox, and thus was born the identity that the fugitive would hold for more than 5 decades. We'll stick with that name for now. It's essentially a new identity he adopted. Cox soon moved to a dot of a town, Hurricane, West Virginia. For 16 years, he built a second life in that state, settling down with his new significant other, Joyce Wade, and raising a son. Ironically, given his record, Cox worked as a truck driver. A 9th grade dropout himself, he also spent time driving a mobile library around to promote childhood literacy. His work caring for horses earned him the nickname Cowboy. He rode in local parades. But Cox and Wade became estranged, and Joyce reported that she feared violence from her ex. When police came around Cox's home near Charleston to deliver a peace warrant, similar to a restraining order, they discovered him hiding in a special compartment he built under his sink. The odd hiding place may have backfired, leading to more suspicion than, for instance, not hiding under the sink. The deputies took him into custody, fingerprinted him, and learned his true identity. Wade stopped pursuing her case against Cox, but he clearly had bigger problems at hand. Held in the jail of Kanawha County, in which the state capital of Charleston is located, Cox shared his already convoluted true story. Probably the proximity to state government helped the case find its way to West Virginia's then Governor Arch Moore, who became an advocate for Cox, vocally denying Ohio their extradition request. Moore claimed that the complaint Wade had filed was bogus, but the actual or perceived threat Wade felt remains a matter of debate. Wade failed to show at her court hearings against Cox, and later she didn't wish to revisit the chapter of her life. As far as Moore was concerned, Cox, the name he would continue using, was a reformed citizen, and welcome to continue life as a free man, with a special provision for his monitoring by the state of West Virginia. And that was that for about 10 years. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Cox became involved with another woman in West Virginia named Brenda, and the two moved to Melbourne, Florida in 1987, along with his son Jim Cox, by then 16. Jim, who would stick by his dad, later noted that the backstory was no secret. He knew who his father was. As his son relates, Cox wasn't so much on the run as fully ensconced in his new life. The move to Florida may well have been motivated by more yearning for warm weather than any desire to lay low. As before, Cox got work as a trucker, hauling trees for a family who owned a large stretch of marshlands on the western edge of the city. Part of the deal was that he'd keep an eye on their property, which was prime trespassing territory for off-road vehicle enthusiasts and poachers, and they gave him a trailer to live in. A bit cold and leaky in the wintertime, Cox reasoned that it wasn't as cold as Ohio could get. Following the loss of his wife, Brenda, to cancer in 1999, he was on his own in his dilapidated trailer home. But by now, Cox was again growing close to his neighbors in the new community, who knew him as an affable cheapskate who loved country music and fried chicken. He stood up as best man for Cheryl Cheatham, a close female friend and hunting companion at her wedding. Her kids knew him as Grandpa Bill. But in 2015, the Northern Ohio office of U.S. Marshals launched a cold case division, and they didn't get much colder than Cox, aka Frank Freshwaters. It's not that hard to track down a fugitive who's not really even hiding. Cox's cover had been blown for decades, and unlike in West Virginia, in Florida there was no one who would fight Ohio's extradition order. The uneventful operation to take Cox in and send him to Ohio went forward. Frank Freshwaters was back. U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott, who had created the cold case squad, commented that he didn't have any opinion regarding whether Freshwaters deserved additional charges or additional jail time. In Elliott's view, if there was a prison escapee on the loose, it was the job of the U.S. Marshals to bring him in, and essentially, it would be up to the courts to handle the rest. As Freshwaters awaited trial in a jail facility for handicapped prisoners in Ohio, again a compliant model prisoner, friends and family showed their support in writing, in pictures, and on social media. The prosecution noted correctly that Freshwaters still owed restitution to the Flint family, who still felt the trauma of Eugene Flint's death 6 decades later, the state pushed for the reinstatement of a 4-year prison sentence based on the original conviction. They declined to press any additional charges for the escape from custody. But in February 2016, the sentence given was very similar to that handed down in 1958, 5 years parole. Freshwater's, now nearly 80, could only walk very short distances and had trouble hearing. His ill-fitting dentures rattled around. There would be little opportunity for him to violate the terms of his release this time around. There was some delay as the state of Ohio made sure that there was a provision for where Freshwaters would stay once released. Finally, on June 15, 2016, Frank Freshwaters smiled as he walked out of state custody for the last time to go and live with his son in West Virginia, looking forward to a return to a private life after his last round of media attention. Do you think there should be a statute of limitations on prison breaks? Or are the U.S. Marshals working to keep criminals from escaping justice by pursuing cold cases? Let us know what you think in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called New Evidence Shows Alcatraz Prisoners Survived the Prison Escape. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.